Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to get to share with you my new friend, Elaine Heath, who brings so much to the table around innovative expressions of church. So before we get that conversation started, I would love for you, Elaine, to introduce yourself the way you like to be introduced.
Hi, it's so great to be here, and I'm honored to be on this podcast. My favorite introduction that was ever made of me was at a Path One event, and they introduced me as Elaine Heath, instigator.
That says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the reason they gave me that name was that I've done so much work. It's just central to my calling to open imaginations of people and fan into flame that desire that's a sacred desire to go and do something new and different in order to fully express the gospel in a local context using that person's everything about that person's life, their resources, everything that they are, their story. And so instigating the formation of new faith communities, and these are communities that heal the world, that heal neighborhoods, and especially that heal the wounds inflicted by Christendom. Yeah. So I was a pastor in East Ohio Conference. That's where I was ordained back in the day. And then I went into academia and worked as a professor of evangelism for 11 years at Perkins School of Theology, the McCreeless professor. And then was recruited to come to Duke Divinity School, where I served as dean and professor of pastoral and missional theology. And then I retired from Duke and founded Neighborhood Seminary, which is a nonprofit. Well, it's a nonprofit, but it's a non-traditional form of theological education and missional formation, spiritual formation for lay people predominantly, to help them neighbor well and be able to live the gospel in their neighborhoods in deep and meaningful ways. So here now I'm the Abbess at the community at Spring Forest, and co-founder of our church here, the church at Spring Forest. And we live in community, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on, I think, in the interview.
Yeah. I definitely want you to share kind of how Spring Forest came into being and kind of what's emerged and bubbled up over the last 6 years in its existence. I know that's kind of changed and adapted to our current reality, I'm sure, in a number of ways. But I told Elaine when we came into the room together that I've probably read all of her books or most of her books. We are very much kindred spirits, and Elaine brings so much to the table, I think, in what it means to embody, to incarnate the gospel in our places and spaces in our local contexts that I think are so significant and so needed in what it means to be the church today, and frankly missing in a lot of ways. And Fresh Expressions really seeks to build faith communities centered around the person and work of Jesus in those everyday places and spaces of life, with people that will, frankly, never come into our existing churches. So, Elaine, we were talking about the fact that innovative expressions of church is nothing new, right? It's something that's happened across the history of the church, the landscape of the church. So we were talking about some specific movements, which we can get to, but are there some that have been especially impactful or meaningful or kind of guides that you have looked to in your own ministry?
There are. The first one would be when the Apostle Paul undergoes this amazing conversion, and it just sort of really upends his whole world. And the magnitude of what happens to him, where he realizes that God is for all people and not just for the Jews. What this is going to mean is very dramatic. We're in one of those culture shifts now. It's just as dramatic as that, because it's like God has escaped from the church. What we think is God has escaped from the church. Right. But so this what's happening now, this new Reformation, is going to prove to be as dramatic, I believe, as when the Apostle Saul becomes Paul, and realizes, oh wait, God is so much bigger than I thought. and cares so much more about everybody and everything than I realize. So there's that one. And then I'm really inspired by the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the early monastic movements of the church, those early efforts, some of which were bizarre. Some of them were just a little crazy, but they were responding to the Spirit's call to do something more, embodying the gospel in ways that were not co-opted by empire. I mean, that's where this was coming from. So that's important to me. Yeah. And then when you go forward, I think of the Beguines, that group of unauthorized lay women who just went ahead and
yes.
and actually just did stuff without permission from anybody.
Yes. We like those ladies.
They went into a lot of trouble for being godly, and you know how it goes. I think of all the radicals of the Reformations, the Anabaptists and Menno Simons and all those folks, and even the ones that were sort of like, we could say proto-Pentecostals, the Lollards, for example. Mm-hmm, these people all got into so much trouble from the inherited church simply because they were listening to the Spirit's call to enliven their faith, to take seriously discipleship, to take seriously the gifts of all God's people. And so they faithfully gave their lives to carrying the gospel forward, even though it was, herky-jerky at times. It involved some really neurotic people at times. And they had to suffer a lot of persecution at times. And so Wesley is another one that, he had his issues and everything, and yet he was faithful to his call. Phoebe Palmer is one of my favorites. Again, somebody with her own issues and yet was faithful, became the mother of the Wesleyan holiness movement. And to me, Phoebe Palmer would be one who's a great Methodist mystic, especially for fresh expressions people, especially for innovators. So I guess that's probably a long enough list.
Yeah, no, that's a great list. And I think the thing that, when we talk about, the inability in a lot of ways of these Christendom models of church connecting with our kind of in this new Reformation era that we're in the midst of. The thing I think it's important for everybody to hear is all the people that Elaine just listed, or all people in the existing or inherited church that really felt the tension of the sometimes disconnect between the inherited church and the wider world, and how the gospel connects to everyday people in everyday life and all of the places and spaces they inhabit, not just in a building for about an hour, one day a week, right? So, and really stretch the limits and push the limits on what it meant to be a follower of Jesus in all of these different times across history. And so Elaine has taught me that I've been saying Beguines wrong. It's Beguines, right? So Beguines are fascinating in that they were a movement of lay women that began in the medieval era, more than 800 years ago, in places across Europe, in Paris and Brussels and in Amsterdam. I mean, those were probably some of the larger communities of Beguines, but they really pushed some of the norms, right? And the beauty, I think, of that movement that I think relates so many, so in so many ways with Fresh Expressions is their ability to kind of live in the world, but express their faith in ways that had a powerful and profound impact on the communities that they inhabited. Not only speaking and preaching and writing in local vernaculars in the language of the people that was very, very different than the church of their day, but having the ability to navigate the scholarly realm and the in the inherited forms of church, even at that time as women, was really, really pushing a lot of norms and societal norms as far as women were concerned, and their ability to to live together and to support one another in the way that they did. I mean, these were all women, which was a little different as well. That kind of grew into these cities of ladies, as they were called. And so I think there are a lot of the contextual quality, the incarnational quality to what they did, that formational, that missional in the world, whereas they could have potentially become nuns or, possibly joined different monastic or monasteries. At that point in time, I think a lot of women were not necessarily, the room was not being made for them in those places if they wanted to be a part of it. So they started and did something on their own. They kind of went out on the edge and did their own thing. And all of these qualities, I think, were really significant to who they became as a movement. So I would love for you, Elaine, is there any other thing that you wanted to kind of share about them? You mentioned them in Longing for Spring that you wrote with Scott Kisker. I know that Mike Moyna, who is one of the fathers of the Fresh Expressions movement in the UK, spoke a great deal to them and the significance of them in Christian history. In one of his books, I can't remember, it was Church in Context or Church in Life, but anything else that you would want to share about them?
Well, it's about another movement that has some things in common with the Beguines, and that would be the spread of the gospel by the ancient Celts, the Celtic tradition, which is a completely separate tradition from the Western Church and from the Orthodox Church. It was its own movement. And Celtic spirituality, Celtic Christianity has been very influential for the development of Spring Forest, for my own theological growth, and just other people that I'm close to that are working on similar things. So if people wanted to read about that, I would recommend John Philip Newell's book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. And just to be maybe a bit of a provocateur, one of the people that you'll read about in that book is Pelagius. And I remember in seminary, Pelagius got a black eye over and over again. Everything that was written about him that we students read was written by his detractors and his enemies, the ones that won the disputes. And so what I've discovered is Pelagius is a kindred spirit. And religious theology that we really need today, especially regarding the sacredness of the created world, and that we are part of the created world. But that's probably enough about that for now.
Yeah, I think. I mean, again, you referred to yourself as an instigator, and all of these folks that you've listed are also instigators of change, right? And change is hard, and sometimes people are skeptical about that. Folks that push the edges or the norms, and yet, just based on the list that you've shared with us, so significant to church history and to who we are today as a result. And I think also, there's nothing new under the sun. These are movements and people that we need to continue to look to help us chart the course for this uncharted territory that we seemingly find ourselves in now, in the now almost third year of the pandemic. But I know something began to kind of take root about 6 years ago with you in Spring Forest. So why don't you share the story of kind of how that came to be, and kind of how that bubbled up, and maybe some things that have maybe changed the trajectory of that along the way, as we often share in forming Fresh Expressions. These are always communities, micro church communities potentially, or communities of people that are looking to center their lives in Christ, that to change and adapt and are nimble and don't necessarily know where they're going, but continuously listen for where the Spirit's calling them and leading them. So please share about Spring Forest.
Sure. Yeah, and you're right. We do have to go into this kind of ministry ready to pivot at any moment. I'm actually teaching a webinar one evening in March you can see the information on the Neighborhood Seminary website, and it's on strategic intent instead of strategic planning. Strategic intent, because that's how you guide communities like this. And anybody who's able to navigate the constant shifting that we have to do really has to operate by strategic intent. And I tap into the Celtic tradition to help us understand what that looks like on the ground. And that's what we use here at Spring Forest. So about 20 years ago, my husband and I bought a farm in Ohio. This was when I was in my very first academic job that was just a couple of years long. And we had in mind to do some things like what we're doing now at Spring Forest. And I only mention that because that vision came to us, more than 20 years ago. And we bought the land, and then I needed to make a job change, and so we could go to Texas. And he had to sell that farm. It was very sad. But when we put the farm on the market, and it was the exact acreage of Spring Forest, by the way, we put the farm on the market, and I sensed God saying to me, don't give up on this dream. It will happen in the future on a better piece of land and when the timing is better. So hold on to this sacred dream. So we held on to this sacred dream all these years. Well, and in Texas, we lived in a suburban community, a sort of multicultural suburban community. So when we got ready to move here, we came on our house hunting trip, and we told our realtor we wanted to look for a rural piece of property because we were thinking, okay, now we will buy that place where this is going to eventually happen. And we were imagining, well, it'll happen mostly after I retire. And we were imagining that would be maybe 10 years until I would retire from working full-time in academia. So we found this. We found this property, and it was so beautiful, and we bought it. And our friends, two of our friends who lived with us in Texas, an older couple named Ed and Wendy Miller, moved with us here. They had lived with us in community in Texas for a few years, and we all just felt like they're supposed to be here with us too. So here we all came. And we began right away doing some retreat ministries and spiritual formation, the kind of things that we did in Texas, although I wasn't able to participate much because my job was so demanding, 60, 70 hours a week.
Yeah.
So we started that. And then we'd been here about a year. We noticed the farm next door was all the high tunnels. There were like 9 high tunnels, hoop houses. We noticed the farmer was taking those down, and we had already befriended that farmer and everybody else around us. We think that's important to get to know your neighbor.
Yes.
So Wendy and I just went over and knocked on the door and asked her, "Are you selling your farm?"
Oh my goodness.
And he said yes. He was having some health problems and so on. And this was a very famous farm in the Triangle. He was very famous for growing salad greens year round, which is hard to do in the heat of the summer. So he had a lot of expertise and everything. And so Randall and I went to talk to him later. That's my husband. And we said, look, we don't even know if this would work out or we can afford it. But before you put it on the market, let us know. Because if we can afford it, we think we'd like to buy it. And we told him the story of back in Ohio 20 years ago.
Wow.
So that started the conversation, and we ended up buying the farm. And right around the time we bought the farm, it was just before we signed the closing documents, actually, I found out I was stepping down as dean. So my whole situation was going to change at Duke. And so we decided, no, we're just going to go for it. So what we did, we invited some friends of ours that were living in Kansas at the time. The husband, Francis, was one of my students at Perkins and had been very involved in all the missional wisdom projects in Dallas. He lived in one of those community houses. He anchored a New Day community in a refugee neighborhood. And he was also my grad assistant and managed the community garden that I had started on campus. And he's from Kenya and was a very experienced pastor and church planter, but was getting his master's degree. So we asked if Francis would come and help us to develop all of this. And so it took some work to, you were dealing with 3 different bishops and kind of conferences and whatnot. But he said, yes, he would come out here. So they came out here and we got started. So they lived in the house next door, the house that's on the farm. We live in our house, And between the two houses had several guest rooms for retreats and for visitors and so on. And we started to rebuild the infrastructure of the farm, which needed some help. So meanwhile, there was just a random collection of people that we'd met along the way in this area, and we told them we're going to start a dinner church. This is fall of 2019. We're going to start a dinner church, and we're going to develop this farm into a revenue stream to fund our mission, and a central part of our mission will be support of refugees and their resettlement here. So we had clarity about that much. Yeah. So off we went, and then there were some problems with, without going into too much detail, there were problems with the process of green cards for all immigrants at that time because of the Trump administration. And so our plan for the for-profit farm business had to be shelved. We were growing things, but we couldn't sell them because of the visa status of our lead farmer.
Okay.
So because he was here on a religious worker visa. So we realized that we weren't going to be able to afford to keep paying for the farm without having income coming from the farm. This was our first major pivot. Because we had clarity about what we were called to do. We have a rule of life: work, prayer, prayer, work, table, and neighbor. So we were doing that, and there were about 30 people involved. But we had to pivot on how much land we'd have, what we would do with our land, what Randall and I would do with our land. And so we had to put it on the market, and our New Faith Community Office folks here and the Bishop and DS were all very supportive as we had to pivot with our expectations for the farming side of things. So that was December of 2019. And then in early 2020, I went out to California to teach at an academy for spiritual formation. And my topic that had been assigned for the week was spiritual discernment for leaders, especially those who were innovating. So I'm teaching about discernment all week, and I get to the fourth day, and I tell the story of how we're having to pivot. And I talk about how we always must hold the vision with open hands.
Yes,
the Apostle Paul gets called by God. God gives Paul this vision of this really strapping Macedonian man. Come over to Macedonia. I'm ready to receive. And so Paul says, yes, I'll go. And he gets there. There was never a Macedonian man. It was a bunch of women by the river. But, I just think if he'd seen a bunch of women by the river, maybe he wouldn't have been as inspired to go,
Whoa, that's that's so good. That's so good. Well, God speaks in the language of his people, does he not?
Yeah, to get us where we need to be. And,
so
there's
good.
An obstacle. God's like a river that flows around. We just kind of
Yes. So good.
So a woman came up to me after that class, this back at the class in California. And meanwhile, our farm's on the market back here in North Carolina. And she says, the Holy Spirit has been speaking to me all week, and I'm sure that my husband and I are supposed to buy your farm so you can keep doing what you're doing. We live in Texas. We're taking care of elderly parents. Oh, by the way, we were missionaries in Ghana for 11 years. We're both, both engineers. We're lay people. But the stuff that you're doing, especially with refugees and with the land, is the sort of thing we'd like to do in our retirement. We've talked about it so many times. And so we could buy your farm and just come out and visit a few times a year and spend a couple of weeks at a time. And then when our parents are gone and don't need us, we can move there and just really join in wholeheartedly with what you're doing.
Wow.
And they bought that farm sight unseen. They bought it within weeks. And what that did was open all sorts of doors. It took the financial burden away.
Yeah. They
said to us, we don't have to earn money from the farm. We're okay with our income. And so they charge us $50 a month to rent this beautiful farm with organic farm with the soil is beautiful. And then they charge just like what an apartment will cost here in Hillsborough for the house to be the parsonage. So this was our next pivot. And then because of COVID, we subdivided our dinner church into neighborhood things according to what people are passionate about. And then, and this couple, Charlie and Mary Kay, are now on our lead team. They just do everything by Zoom, and they come and go, a few times a year.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so what has happened is over the last 2 years now, since COVID began, our church has really grown. COVID didn't harm us at all in terms of, a lot of churches, people were driven out of the building, and then we're like, what do we do now?
Right.
But we
Right.
never had a building, and we don't want one. We have a barn, and
Right.
we've got gardens, and so we were able to continue to build our fellowship because it was all outdoors anyway. And we have been able to build up the health of the farm and form partnerships with many organizations and churches. And we've got a whole pack of volunteers who can't stand religion, but really care about the environment, or they
Yes.
love Jesus,
Yes.
but can't take the church. And so
Right.
now we have another pivot coming. Francis is getting ready to go back to Great Plains Conference because he feels like he's fulfilled what he was called here to do in co-founding this community. And
Okay.
we being our community, and Francis and myself have asked that I be appointed now when Francis leaves to be the bivocational abbess for the whole community, so that the
Okay.
dispersed community as well as who's living on the campus of our ministry. So so now we've just got a whole range of ministries that are happening, and it's very exciting. And this is like the most rewarding form of church I've ever been
Mm-hmm.
a part of. And we even are going to start having a worship gathering once a month again around a campfire. We'll start that up again in March. We've had to just suspend that kind of close togetherness because of, but
Right.
we'll be able to do that in March. So.
Well, there's two things that, I mean, there's a number of things that you've mentioned, I think, that are bear repeating or undergirding. And one of them is, facing these obstacles that you've faced along the way and not like throwing in the towel, but saying, what's God inviting us to do, and not necessarily seeing those obstacles as obstacles, but potentially opportunities. And I think that's certainly something that that many of us who have been a part of the Fresh Expressions movement can testify to. And that whole idea of strategic intent instead of strategic planning is so significant to that, right?
Yeah, totally.
Understanding your why, I think, really determines your how. And as circumstances or situations change, and you have to adapt, it doesn't change the why, right?
Right.
Like you still persist in the why, and those obstacles can become huge opportunities, like you said, for partnerships and for God to provide like only God can, as we kind of hold on loosely to whatever it is that we feel led to or called to do. Another thing that you've really, I think, in case anybody missed it, you've really kind of described this whole idea of a decentralized mission, right?
Yeah.
That you describe Spring Forest as, and that's different than our understandings of the inherited or the ecclesiology of our inherited models of church, right? This whole decentralized. We have come so far from this priesthood of all believers idea that Peter talks about in his letters. So say a little bit about that, because I think that's significant to how the character of the community really tastes like the community, right? The community. It smells like it. It tastes like it. It looks like it. Rather than Elaine saying, "Here's my grandiose idea. Let's do this," right? But that it's kind of emerged from the community, and that's so significant, I think, in these missional movements. So, say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this concept, part of it is based on what makes for a good missional church, where its self-understanding is the sent out people instead of the sucked in people.
Yes.
And so our rule of life, which is prayer, work, table, and neighbor, the idea here is that anyone who is on our lead team, and there are 17 people on our lead team, is going to practice that in their own neighborhood. They're going to practice that where their other circles of people are. And they'll foster community and foster self-giving of that community in ways that make sense contextually. So, for example, one of our people, Lisa Bachman, who's a retired deaconess, a United Methodist deaconess, lives in a neighborhood on the Eno River. It's called the Brigadoon neighborhood. It's such a fun name. She has enough land that she said she would like to start a satellite garden, satellite to our farm in her neighborhood, a community garden that she could share with her neighbors. Wow. And she knew her neighbors before a little bit, but not in depth. And she's lived in the neighborhood for some time. So we helped her set up a garden in her neighborhood and helped her to, figure out how. And people just started coming anyway. People are always curious about community gardens. Always want to kind of hang out and watch and maybe help a bit. So out of that community garden, several of our volunteers and one of our persons who's now a 30 hours a week staff person that we pay as a farmer, gotten involved here at the farm and involved in other things we do, like refugee support and ESL and things like that. So that's a contextualized expression for Lisa. But then another thing about Lisa is in her work as a deaconess, she's been passionate for a long time about immigration rights and what causes forced migration and what the devastating consequences are. So she wrote a grant and she started within us a group called Hope for Humanity. And she wrote some grants to get funding to get it going. And she has now some webinars and things like that she's developed during COVID, that she's educated a whole bunch of churches and other groups to understand these issues and how people can get involved. But in addition to that, she's working with us on our new ESL program, supporting it with H4H funding and so on. We have actually about 20 people, adults in our ESL class, and there are about 10 kids. Okay. And it's a big program now that we're doing in partnership with a couple other churches. So for Lisa, her neighborhood group is around the garden, and her larger sense of calling is this educational piece. That's one example. We have another person who lives in Winston-Salem, that's an hour and a half from here. And she leads our monthly contemplative spirituality group called Breathe. It's on Zoom, so it's not a big deal that she's up there, but then she and her husband come for leader meetings or campfires when it's safe and things like that. So for her, it's a Zoom neighborhood. But she and her husband are also practicing the rule of life and hospitality in their actual neighborhood where they live. It's like that. It's a whole range of things.
Yeah, it's recognizing, first of all, the uniqueness of the gifts that people bring to the table, right? And literally and figuratively, and then empowering them to utilize those gifts, right? To expand the mission and to be that incarnational witness wherever it is that they are, whether it be in a neighborhood down the street or an hour and a half away, expanding the imprint and the mission of the church and all of these different places, and again recognizing the significance of the difference in the gifts that are brought, but also the significance in all of those gifts being deployed together for the furthering of the mission of God. So that's a beautiful example of that. One of the things that you mentioned is this rule of life and how that kind of orders what you do, how you live, how you practice. So how did that kind of come into being? I know we were talking about the Beguines, and they didn't have a formal rule of life that kind of emerged from their local context, from their local community. So how did your rule of life kind of come into being?
It was a matter of first moving here and living here and then naming what we were doing in community. So actually naming what was happening. Instead of having a theoretical thing that we're trying to live into, it was naming what we were doing. So we were definitely praying together daily. We do morning and evening prayer 5 days a week, 20 minutes long each time. And we do it on Zoom so everybody can be on there. So we were naming that. We were praying together. We were working together, working on spiritual formation work, working on the farm and the forest, and whatever else work needed to be done, dishes, food, hospitality. We were practicing the table together. eating together as much as we can, and practicing the Eucharistic table together. That's very inclusive. And we were neighboring together. We have a self-understanding that our community is not for ourselves, but for to give away. And the more we give it away, the more we feel fully alive too. So it was putting language to what was happening as these sort of core practices. But what we've discovered then is those core practices of that are our rule of life now also capture what our strategic intent is. Yes. And so by following that, it's a more of a journey mentality than a destination mentality. So we're always on pilgrimage, and these are the practices that keep us on the journey together.
That's wonderful. Beautiful. Elaine, is there something perhaps that I have not asked you or that we have not talked about that you think is important to this conversation in regards to innovative expressions of church?
Yeah, I'll say one more thing, and that's about money. You can't have these conversations without thinking of money, because it costs money to do something new. It costs money to do something old too. It costs money to do things that aren't working anymore. So
yeah, exactly. Yes.
Part of the way forward, especially for fresh expressions and for even the inherited church that's going to survive this great Reformation, is to find ways to fund our own ministries that are not reliant upon 2 or 3 families with deep pockets. But instead for us to find ways for substantial teams that are bivocational and mostly lay people who are well equipped. And so part of what we're developing here, I've explained everything we're developing, but in asking to be appointed, myself to be appointed when Francis leaves, we've asked for no salary, because I earn my income teaching and leading retreats, and my Social Security, kind of like sort of cobble together my income, but it's enough. And then everybody else on the team, we do pay very tiny stipends to some of the leaders because of the gasoline involved in what they're doing, the transportation really. But developing models of ministry that are predominantly lay-led, with well-equipped lay people, which is why we developed Neighborhood Seminary, and that are self-funding through some kind of small business that does good in the world, that's good for the earth, and that provides some jobs for a few people, especially those who may be difficult to employ in other situations. That's something we really got to pay attention to.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And it sounds like, that this is a multi-vocational, at least bivocational, multi-vocational venture with that leadership team and those who are really kind of living out this rule of life and what it means to be on mission with God where you are. Yeah. So thank you so much, Elaine. This has been such a rich conversation, so many gold nuggets in it. And I look forward to seeing what the next chapter of Spring Forest looks like. And whatever your next book is, sign me up.
Okay. It's called Trauma-Informed Evangelism, and it'll be out in early 2023. Eerdmans wrote it.
Okay, wonderful.
Charles Kaiser and I wrote it together. So, all right.
So poignant for such a time as this. So poignant.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a joy to be with you.
Thank you, Elaine.